A few years back, I went through an experience that still sticks with me. It all started when my best friend and I talked about planning another camping trip. We're both big on spending time in nature and try to camp at least once a month. This was late November in North Carolina, where the weather could be mild or freezing. That year, it was freezing. Our girlfriends had recently been on our case about never inviting them along, though they knew we often did rough camping in damp, cold conditions. To be honest, we were surprised they even wanted to come. For us, the tougher the environment, the more exciting the trip felt. A bit of that adventurous ego. I was thrilled they wanted to come, so we made our plans for the weekend. Saturday arrived, and we packed everything up, eager to get back into the mountains. We headed west for about 3 hours into our usual camping spot. As we approached our little-known campsite, it got colder, and a steady rain started. I could see my girlfriend growing anxious as daylight was fading and the weather was turning. My friend and I were used to it, though, so we assured her it'd be fine. Our campsite was a scenic overlook where you could pull over to view distant mountain peaks. By the time we arrived, it was dark, so all we could see was the glow of distant city lights. If you've been in the mountains, you know how quickly the darkness sets in after sundown. It was raining and near freezing by this point, with the wind whipping around us as we unloaded the car. Our girlfriends looked less than thrilled, shifting from excited to wondering why they wanted to join us in the first place. The spot we used was off a hidden trail leading down a steep, rocky slope, about 80 feet below the overlook. It wasn't an official trail, just one where locals might sneak down to hang out. Camping there was technically off-limits, but we'd always liked its seclusion. We moved carefully, trying to avoid any mishaps as we made our way down. With our gear ready, my girlfriend and I moved about 50 yards from the car to the trailhead and waited for my friend and his girlfriend. After a few minutes, though, we wondered why they were taking so long. It was cold, wet, and dark, and we were growing a little impatient. After around 10 minutes, I finally decided to check. When I got to the car, I found my friend and his girlfriend arguing. "What's going on?" I asked, only to hear her say, "He locked the keys in the car." By now, it was nearly 10 p.m., raining, freezing, and with zero cell service. I was instantly annoyed. If there was one thing we didn't need, it was this. I returned to my girlfriend to let her know, and I could see her starting to wince from the cold, which aggravated her joint issues. I told my friend we were going down to set up a fire to keep warm and would be back to help with the car. We turned on our headlamps and carefully started down the slippery, rocky slope. The mist made it hard to see, reflecting our lights and creating a foggy haze. Holding each other's gear, we inched down the slope in a slow, repetitive process. We were about 10 minutes from the bottom when my girlfriend froze. "What's that?" she whispered, a hint of fear in her voice. Looking down, I squinted through the fog and saw what appeared to be a tarp. "Hey, free tarp," I thought, assuming someone had lost it. As I moved closer, though, I noticed something odd. A grocery store shopping basket beside it with some wrappers scattered around. My girlfriend looked terrified. "Is that a person under the tarp?" she asked. I tried to reassure her, doubting anyone would be sleeping in such harsh conditions, so far out with no fire or gear. I went closer to prove it was nothing, but just as I reached for the tarp, it moved. Both of us froze. I stared, my mind refusing to accept that anyone could be out here alone. It must have been the wind, I thought, but then it moved again. That was not the wind. Someone was waking up under that tarp. My heart pounded as I turned to my girlfriend and whispered, "Run!" She didn't need to be told twice and scrambled back up the rocks as fast as she could. I heard a groggy moan and rushed to follow her, turning off my light and listening as I went. I could hear whoever it was shifting stones around. They were awake, and now up and moving. I hesitated, wondering if they were lost or injured. "Are you okay?" I called out. "We can help." Silence. Hello. No response. That was enough for me. I bolted up the trail to join my girlfriend at the car, where she was visibly shaken. I explained to our friends what had happened, and now everyone was scared. And, thanks to the locked car, we were stuck. We huddled under a tarp to keep warm while my friend wandered around, trying to find cell service. I kept my eyes glued to the trailhead, just in case that person appeared. Finally, my friend got through to a locksmith, who arrived after a long wait and an even longer bill. We told him what happened, and he urged us to get out of there, mentioning strange stories about people vanishing or being found dead in those mountains. We decided not to camp that night and drove back in tense silence. Even now, I still wonder who that person was. Were they hiding from someone? Just an unusually tough camper? How did they end up there with no gear? Why didn't they have a fire? We were miles from any town in a location most people wouldn't know about. It didn't feel like somewhere anyone could just survive. This experience made me rethink my approach to camping. I realized I'd been reckless, especially bringing my girlfriend to an unfamiliar spot at night. I haven't camped in the dark since, and neither girlfriend has ever asked to come along again. We never went back to that spot. I live at the base of the Blue Ridge Mountains in northern Georgia. It's a beautiful area with miles of national forest, several nice state parks, and plenty of great places for camping. Unfortunately, my small town is pretty poor. While there are some residents who moved in from Atlanta and other areas, a lot of the locals here struggle financially. I work remotely as a freelance writer, which allows me to live here, but if it weren't for that, I'd likely need to move elsewhere. It's the kind of small town where if you don't have a strong opportunity, you could get stuck without much chance to get ahead. Besides a few well-paid professionals, the main jobs here are at grocery stores, fast food places, and a Walmart. To the east of town, there's a large national forest with great camping spots and several little-used trails. I love hiking there with my dog, but it can sometimes be a bit unnerving. It's about a 10-minute drive from town, and there's no phone signal or houses around for miles. Over the years, there have been numerous vehicle break-ins at the trailheads, with broken glass littering some of the gravel parking lots. Occasionally, there are suspicious-looking people hanging around the trailheads or driving around the rough Forest Service roads. Some people have cars that look like they cost less than $500, flying down roads only suitable for off-road vehicles. And some of the people you see in those cars look pretty rough, adding to the slightly eerie vibe. Still, it's a fantastic place to camp as long as you're cautious. A few years ago, my friends and I decided to play paintball in the forest, probably against the rules, I know. We decided to make it an overnight camping trip so we could play the next day as well. After an uneventful day of paintball, we drove to a nearby camping area. Unfortunately, all the spots were taken, likely by a church group or another large gathering. It was getting late, and we didn't know other camping spots in the area, so we kept driving, looking for another option. As we drove deeper into the forest, it started getting darker, and we began to worry about finding a spot. We had GPS, but with no cell service, it wasn't much help. Eventually, we turned onto an old, rough road. It looked like the Forest Service had tried to close it off with a dirt mound and a broken metal gate lying nearby, but off-road vehicles had been crossing over it for some time, so we decided to follow suit with our high-clearance truck. We followed an old gravel road for a few miles and came across a clearing by a small creek. There was a makeshift setup with blue tarps over a table nailed to a tree, which seemed odd, but it was nearly dark, and we didn't want to keep searching. We left the truck's lights on while setting up camp, noticing trash scattered in the woods around the site. I picked up a green bottle and realized it was insecticide. It seemed strange for someone to dump trash so far from town, but we were too tired to think much of it. We set up camp, cracked open some beers, and cooked a pot of chili. Around 11 p.m., we noticed a faint glow coming from the other side of a nearby hill. At first, we thought it was moonlight, but the angle didn't seem right. It was a soft, stationary glow, like the faint light from a distant city. There weren't any other access roads nearby, so we ruled out other campers. Curious and slightly buzzed from a few rum and cokes, two of us, Jacob and I, decided to go check it out while our friend Isaac stayed behind to tend to the fire. As we walked towards the glow, we noticed something strange. The trees had their bark stripped in circular bands around their trunks. We joked about it being the work of a ghost beaver as we climbed the hill, probably louder than we should have been due to the alcohol. Just as we neared the top, Jacob tripped and yelled. Suddenly, the light went out. We exchanged uneasy looks and decided we didn't need to see what the light was after all. We walked back to camp, occasionally looking over our shoulders. As we got closer, I saw Isaac near the fire, wearing a hooded jacket I hadn't seen him wear before. He was carrying a paintball gun, which seemed odd since they were supposed to be locked in the truck. The fire had burned low, making it hard to see clearly, but it looked like he was searching for something, even peering into the tent at one point. We figured he was just walking around to stretch his legs or maybe to find a quiet spot away from camp. When we got back, Isaac emerged from the tent, stumbling slightly. He looked a bit worse for wear and said he had a few more drinks after we left. We asked him why he was carrying a paintball gun around, and he looked confused, insisting the guns were still locked in the truck. We checked, and sure enough, all the equipment was exactly as we'd left it, with the truck keys still hidden underneath in a magnetic holder. That gave me a sinking feeling. When we asked Isaac what he'd been doing while we were gone, he said he'd been watching videos on his phone before dozing off, but he hadn't been outside with the gun or wearing any hooded jacket. Someone had been walking around our campsite, and it wasn't him. Though none of us were sober enough to drive safely, we hurriedly packed up and left, deciding to head back to my place for the night. We didn't even bother fully packing the tent, just folded it down with the sleeping bags still inside. As I started the truck and drove towards the road, we noticed something gray blocking our path. The metal barrier that had been tossed aside earlier was now propped back on top of the dirt mound. Not wanting to get out, I nudged it with the truck's metal guard, and it fell off. Thankfully, we crossed it without damaging the tires. As we continued down the gravel road, I noticed a vehicle following us with its lights off, staying about 1,000 feet behind. We only saw glimpses of it under the moonlight on the straighter parts of the road. I sped up as much as I dared, and it kept pace but didn't get any closer. After nearly an hour of tense driving, we reached the main road. I took a different route home just to be safe. Camping in remote areas can be fun, but it can also be risky. I've driven past that metal barrier since then, and it's always securely in place. I doubt I'll ever go down that road again. A couple of years ago, my friend and I had an experience that I'll never forget. It all started with us mentioning how we needed to get back to camping soon. We both love the outdoors and try to camp at least once or twice a month. It was late November in a chilly part of Virginia, where the weather can swing between unusually warm and freezing cold. This time, it was the latter. Our girlfriends had been playfully nagging us about why we never took them along on these trips. Honestly, the kind of camping we do is rough, usually in cold, rainy conditions, and we didn't think they'd enjoy it. To our surprise, they were eager to join, and while we were a bit skeptical, we thought it could be fun. So we planned to go camping that upcoming weekend. When Saturday arrived, we packed up and hit the road, heading about 2.5 hours west into the mountains. The closer we got to our usual camping spot, the colder it got, and it soon began to rain. I could see my girlfriend starting to worry about the fading daylight and the idea of setting up camp in the wet, cold conditions. But since my friend and I did this all the time, we reassured her everything would be fine. Our chosen spot was a hidden overlook where you could park and admire the mountain view. By the time we arrived, though, it was already dark, and all we could see were the faint city lights far off in the distance. When the sun sets behind the mountains, it gets pitch black quickly, especially with the thick clouds and rain that night. The temperature must have been around 34 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was really picking up as we unloaded the car. Our girlfriends went from excited to questioning why they came at all. This spot has a narrow trail that leads down a steep rocky area, about a 75-foot drop to where we'd set up camp. It's not an official trail, just a place where adventurous folks might come to hang out. You're technically not allowed to camp there, but we were young and a bit reckless. It's tricky to get down, so we always take it slow to avoid accidents. After getting my gear out of the car, my girlfriend and I went about 50 yards down to the start of the trail, set down our bags, and waited for my friend and his girlfriend to catch up. A few minutes went by, then 5 or 10, and we were getting a little impatient. Finally, I decided to go check what was taking so long. When I got back to the car, I found my friend and his girlfriend in the middle of an argument. He had locked the keys in the car. It was close to 10 p.m., cold, raining, and we were stranded with no cell service. The closest town was at least 20 miles away. I was pretty frustrated, but I let my girlfriend know and decided to go down the trail to set up a fire, since she looked like she was starting to shiver from the cold. My main priority was getting her warm. We turned on our headlamps and slowly started our descent down the steep, rocky path. The rain made it slick, and the mist made it hard to see clearly with the headlamp. We worked our way down, taking turns carrying each other's gear, repeating the process as we went. After about 20 minutes, we were almost at the spot where we usually camp when my girlfriend suddenly stopped. "What's that?" she said, her voice uneasy. I squinted down through the fog and spotted a tarp. I thought, great, free tarp, and figured it had blown down from the top. As I got closer, I noticed something else. A small grocery basket, like the ones you'd find in a store, with snack wrappers inside. Just then, my girlfriend whispered, "Is that a person under the tarp?" I told her no way. We were in the middle of nowhere with no other cars or signs of anyone else. No campfire, no tent, nothing. I crept closer, planning to grab the tarp to show her it was empty. But as my light hit it, the tarp moved. We both froze, trying to rationalize what we were seeing. Surely it had to be the wind, right? But then it moved again. This wasn't the wind. Someone was under that tarp. My heart started pounding, and I quietly whispered to my girlfriend, "Run!" She took off, scrambling up the rocks, and I followed. Behind us, we heard a groggy moan, and the sound of stones shifting as the person got up. I stopped partway up, turned off my light, and listened. I could hear them moving around, but couldn't tell if they were following us. Trying to be rational, I called out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" But there was only silence. Deciding not to wait any longer, I hurried up the rest of the trail. We reached the car, and my girlfriend was visibly shaken. When we told our friends what had happened, they were equally freaked out, especially with the car locked and no way to leave. My friend managed to find a spot where he could get a faint signal and called a locksmith, who eventually arrived. The locksmith, hearing our story, advised us to leave immediately, telling us stories of strange occurrences and disappearances in the area. We didn't stay to camp that night, we just headed home in silence. Looking back, the whole experience made me rethink my confidence in my camping skills. I hadn't considered what could go wrong with other people as a threat. Since then, I don't camp at night, and our girlfriends haven't asked to join us again. We've never returned to that particular spot. Back when I was in school, I was relatively well-liked and had a small group of really close friends: Anna, Leo, Caleb, and Jenny. We shared a lot of adventures back then, from road trips and beach days to camping. Caleb's family was quite well off, and all our families were pretty relaxed about rules. The summer before we all entered 8th grade, we planned a camping trip with Jenny's older sister Mia and Caleb's older brother Sam. So there were 7 of us all together. Jenny, Caleb, and I were 13, Leo and Anna were 14, and Mia and Sam were both 17. We decided to camp out in a forest about 20 miles from Caleb's house. It was fairly remote, with Caleb's neighborhood being the nearest to it. There was no phone reception or electronic signal. We reached the campsite without any issues and set up our tents, splitting the group with the girls in one tent and the boys in another. In hindsight, having a group of kids from 13 to 17 years old camping out without phones might not have been the best idea, but our parents trusted we'd be safe since the forest was known to be quiet and uneventful. After setting up camp, we went for a swim in a lake nearby, then returned to cook dinner over a fire we built about 20 feet from our tents. We had s'mores, joked around, and did all the classic camping activities. Later, Jenny and Mia said they were tired and went to bed, leaving Sam, Anna, Caleb, Leo, and me to stay up, sharing scary stories and having a good time. Not long after, Mia came out, looking annoyed, and told us to stop messing with the side of her tent. She said someone kept brushing against it, running something along it. None of us had moved from the group, so Sam shrugged it off, saying it was probably just a branch. Anna and I decided to call it a night as well and went to our tent, where Jenny was already asleep. I lay down closest to the tent entrance, with Mia next to Jenny on the far side, and Anna in between. I fell asleep quickly but woke up suddenly sometime later, unsure why. I checked my phone, which I had only brought to take pictures, and saw it was around 2:15 a.m. I listened in the dark, my eyes adjusting, and heard a faint tapping sound on the tent, followed by a low giggle. It sounded like a deep, masculine voice, though I couldn't be sure. After what felt like forever, but was likely only a couple of minutes, the sound stopped. I told myself it was probably a branch or a prank and went back to sleep. At dawn, Anna woke me up, and everyone decided to go for a morning hike, planning to spend another night camping. We split into 2 groups. Mia, Jenny, Anna, and I headed out on a trail, while the boys stayed behind to fish, swim, or prepare more food. A couple of hours later, we returned to find the boys gone from the campsite. Mia and Jenny went to check near the lake while Anna and I walked back toward the tents, and I nearly screamed at what we found. The tents had been slashed. When I took a closer look, it seemed the cuts were made with a small, sharp blade, like a pocket knife. As Mia, Jenny, and the boys rushed back after hearing us scream, we all felt pretty freaked out. We decided to pack up and head home early because, aside from the damaged tents, we were all a bit on edge. Our nervousness only grew when Sam discovered his car's tires had been slashed. With no phone service and a car unable to drive, we were in a tough spot. Mia's tires, fortunately, were intact, so she offered to drive Caleb and Jenny to a nearby place to call 911 and inform our parents. Her car didn't have space for more than 3 people, as the trunk was packed with camping gear. So, Leo, Sam, Anna, and I stayed back and decided to start hiking towards the main road, hoping to meet Mia halfway. I remember my phone died by 1 p.m., but Leo and Anna still had theirs, and they kept updating us on our progress. As we walked, I began hearing footsteps and branches snapping behind us. My anxiety spiked, and I mentioned it to Sam, who started glancing over his shoulder more often. We'd been walking for about half an hour when Sam suddenly shouted, "Run!" I looked back just as 3 hooded figures appeared behind us, all over 6 feet tall, 2 holding knives. Though it was daylight, they wore masks, hiding their faces. Sam, who was 6 feet 1 inch, couldn't have taken on all 3. Terrified, we bolted, running as fast as we could. Thankfully, they seemed to lose interest or got tired because they eventually stopped chasing us. When we finally reached the road, we kept moving, glancing back every few seconds until Mia arrived. We informed the police, who checked the woods but found no signs of anyone else or any proof beyond our photos and the slashed tents. I'm grateful we managed to escape, knowing things could have ended much differently. At the time, I was about 5 feet 10 inches and only 125 pounds. Anna was around 5 feet 1 inch and barely over 100 pounds, and Leo was just 5 feet 9 inches and maybe 135 pounds. Looking back, I'm thankful Sam kept watch and that we all stayed active enough to outrun whatever danger was lurking that day. My spouse and I went camping for the first time ever in New Mexico as part of a long road trip to the western states. I picked a spot that looked amazing, perched on a mountain overlooking gorgeous scenery. The site was isolated, right beside a steep drop-off and deep in a national forest about 18 miles down rough dirt roads. When we arrived, we set up our tent, took a small hike, and snapped a few photos of the landscape. We saw some cars parked around 5 p.m. and decided to chat with some fellow campers nearby after hearing there might be a storm that night. We met 4 local guys who assured us the storm wouldn't be that bad in this area. That convinced us to stick around. Later, we wandered a bit further down the campsite and saw a woman with her dog and another person. We waved, continued our hike into the woods, and soon returned to our campsite. Because of the storm forecast, we were one of only 7 people staying the night. We watched the sun go down, and, as darkness fell, double-checked that our car was just a few yards away before retreating to our tent. With the storm clouds thick above, no stars were visible, so we decided to try to get some sleep in case we could sleep through the rough weather. It was a wildly windy night, making it hard to fall asleep, but eventually, we managed a bit of rest. I woke up around 10:30 p.m. to booming thunder rumbling through the mountains and rain pouring down, feeling nervous about potential flash floods, especially given our position near the cliff. I tried to calm myself and eventually drifted off again. I woke up again, closer to midnight, to the sound of something heavy hitting our tent, like someone was pushing or hitting it. The noise continued, sporadically. I lay frozen, absolutely terrified, when I suddenly heard footsteps, slow and steady, approaching the tent. My heart was pounding, and I was sure whatever was outside could hear it. Then, a deep sigh sounded from the other side of the tent. Imagining a bear, I braced myself and squeezed my spouse's hand repeatedly to wake him up. However, he just mumbled, "What's wrong?" At which point the footsteps stopped. After a moment, I explained what I'd heard, and we tried to convince ourselves it was just an animal passing by. Still, the occasional thumping on our tent continued, and my mind was racing. Eventually, we decided it must be pine cones or branches falling from the trees above us, and tried once more to fall asleep, hoping we could laugh about this in the morning. But just minutes later, our tent caved in on my spouse's side, whispering that something seemed to be pressing down on his head. He gave it a push, and we heard the familiar sound of something heavy sliding off our tent. Then we realized it was snowing, and ice had been collecting on the tent, falling from the trees above. Relieved that it was ice and not a bear, we cleared the tent and settled back in, turning on a small light for comfort. We felt a bit safer, ready to get through the night. It was around 3 a.m., and we closed our eyes, hoping for a few hours of sleep. Just as we started to drift off, though, I heard something that was truly chilling. A woman's scream, piercing the silence. She yelled, "What's happening?" And "Oh my God!" with such terror that we froze, staring at each other, petrified. I turned off our light immediately, panicking as we tried to figure out what to do. A few minutes later, we heard her again, screaming, "No, no, no," as the sound of a car speeding away filled the air. It was terrifyingly silent after that, with only the sound of icy rain on our tent. Her screams sounded desperate, almost as if she were yelling after the car, pleading for something. This was my breaking point. I could handle the storm, I could handle potential animals nearby, but I couldn't handle a screaming person in the dead of night. We decided we needed to leave, and though we briefly considered abandoning our tent, we stayed calm, grabbed our valuables, and moved quickly to our car. I shut the doors, leaving the lights off, while my spouse went back to pack up our tent. As soon as he got back, I started the car and called for help, explaining what we'd heard and where we were. They promised to send someone out, but being so deep in the forest with rough road conditions, we knew it would take a while. We started driving out around 3:30 a.m. As we passed the site, my spouse noticed something that sent chills down my spine. The 4 guys we talked to earlier had left, but their tents remained, while all 3 of their cars were gone. Whatever had scared them away, they had left in a hurry. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the thought that the figure outside our tent might not have been an animal, but someone lurking in the dark, who may have gone after the woman we'd seen hiking earlier. I hope that everyone made it out safely. This story happened to me last summer and was probably the scariest experience I've ever had. I'm sharing it in hopes that it might help others. One thing I've learned over the years is that while the world can be amazing, it also has some truly twisted people, and I've had the misfortune of seeing that side up close. I'm a very social person and enjoy hanging out with friends whenever I can. I'm also the kind of person who's always looking for the next big adventure. At the time of this story, I was a 16-year-old guy, and I had a decent-sized group of friends, both boys and girls, from school. We had done a lot of wild things together throughout high school. Just after graduation, we wanted to do something unforgettable before we all went off to college. So we decided to go camping in a remote spot for 3 days. Somehow, all our parents agreed, so our group of 6 headed out. Me and my girlfriend, Sam, my friend Brian and his girlfriend, Katie, and Tom and his girlfriend, Sarah. We planned to set up 3 tents so each couple would have their own space, as you can probably guess why. Having been a Boy Scout, I knew what we'd need for 3 days to get by: food, water, and other essentials. Being rebellious teenagers, we also packed plenty of drinks and some weed for our adventure. So, in mid-July, we set off for our camping trip. After hours of driving and taking random back roads, we finally found a spot that looked isolated but not creepy. There were a few houses nearby, though not close enough for anyone to hear us. The first night was pretty uneventful. We smoked a bit, had some drinks, and eventually went to bed. The next day, we decided to explore the woods a bit, though Brian and Katie stayed back to watch the campsite and spend time together. We followed a trail we'd found earlier, thinking it was used by hunters in the area. We came across an old cemetery, which seemed to still have visitors since there were flowers and notes left there. Beyond the cemetery, we found a larger trail with tire marks and a small parking lot. After spotting a few deer, we decided to head back as it was getting late. That night, we really went wild since we were leaving the next day and didn't want to take back any extra booze or weed. We all assumed it would be another peaceful night like the last one, but we were so wrong. All of us woke up to a scream coming from Tom and Sarah's tent and heard the fabric tearing as if someone was slashing it. Tom managed to hit the guy hard with his flashlight, giving him and Sarah a chance to escape to the car. The problem was that Tom's tent was closest to the car, while the other 2 tents were closer to the trail. So, to get to Tom's car, we had to pass whoever was attacking them. Thankfully, the buzz from our partying faded quickly. Tom yelled, "Cemetery," and I immediately understood. We could escape down the trail on the other side of the cemetery. I quickly grabbed Brian, Katie, and Sam, and we ran towards the trail with my phone flashlight on to guide us. As we reached the cemetery, we could hear the guy chasing us, but still at a distance. We climbed over the cemetery fence and hid. Soon, we heard the sound of someone clambering over the fence. He tracked us down, probably because of Tom's shout. We stayed completely still as we heard footsteps approaching. In that moment, I realized I had a small pocket knife on me. As he got closer to me, I seized my chance and stabbed him in the back of the knee. He fell with a shout, dropping his weapon. Just then, headlights appeared. Tom had returned. We bolted for the car. In the brief light, I saw the man was tall and bulky, his eyes filled with fury. I was the last one in the car, and Tom floored it before I even had my door fully closed. We eventually found a nearby house where an elderly couple let us in, gave us food, and let us rest. The next morning, the man accompanied us back to our campsite with his rifle. Nothing was missing, but all our tents were slashed. The woman had called the police, and they were at their home when we returned to give our statements. The officers said there wasn't enough evidence to track the guy down, but promised to look into it. We drove home in silence, all of us processing what had just happened. The police never found the guy, and even though we barely talk about it now, it's an experience we'll never forget. If I have any advice for you, it's this: always pick a well-populated place to camp. It may not be as thrilling, but it's much safer. Stay safe, everyone. When I was 20, I joined a group similar to Scouts for older teens and young adults. It was co-ed with both boys and girls, and they organized a week-long camping trip that I decided to go on with a friend. However, a few days before the trip, my friend Ben backed out, so I ended up going alone, ready to meet new people in the mountains. I wasn't worried. I could handle myself. When I arrived, I was the only girl among the crew, which was slightly uncomfortable at first, but most of the guys were friendly and open to including me. They treated me as one of the guys, even though they weren't used to having a girl around. But one guy, Adam, was different. On the first day, he couldn't stop staring at me, which made me uneasy, though I brushed it off as maybe he just didn't know how to act around girls. On the next day's hike, we split into pairs and I ended up with Adam. He seemed overly enthusiastic about us hiking alone together. He was smaller than me, maybe 5 feet 6 inches, with messy hair and a lean frame. I figured I could defend myself if anything went wrong, so I didn't object. Before we started, he repeatedly asked if I needed help putting on sunscreen. I kept saying no, but he was persistent until one of the other guys told him to stop. While we were hiking, he started asking me questions, simple ones at first, like my age, I told him 20, where I lived, and if I had siblings. Then his questions got uncomfortable. He asked if I'd heard about certain topics I didn't want to discuss, and I pretended I didn't know what he was talking about, hoping he'd drop it. But he kept going, explaining these things to me with an unsettling smile. I kept my eyes on the trail, doing my best to stay calm, though I was feeling uneasy. Then he started talking about my pale skin, asking if I used moisturizer and if it bruised easily. He even tried to touch my hand, but I pulled away, holding onto my backpack tightly. I felt exposed in my tank top, feeling his gaze on me the whole time. At one point, he mentioned how marks and bruises would show up on my skin. His tone made my stomach churn. He then asked personal questions I won't repeat, which shocked me into silence. I quickened my pace, desperate to put distance between us, but he stayed close. Eventually, I saw 2 other campers ahead, and I rushed over, asking if we could all hike together. They seemed surprised at first but agreed when they saw my anxious expression. Adam looked annoyed but stayed silent, and I was relieved to have the others with me for the rest of the hike. When we finished the trail, one of the guys offered to switch partners for the descent, and I immediately accepted, glad to finally be away from Adam's unsettling presence. Later, back at camp, my new hiking partner asked if Adam had been bothering me. I brushed it off, not wanting to admit how disturbed I'd been by a younger kid. I was 20 after all and felt I should be able to handle it. That night, I slept alone in my tent, as the only girl, while everyone else shared. My tent was set up a bit away from the others, which felt isolating, but the scout leaders insisted it was best for privacy. Late that night, I heard noises outside my tent. Assuming it was an animal, I tried to go back to sleep, but then I heard the zipper of my tent being opened. Opening my eyes just a crack, I saw Adam's eye peering in, staring straight at me. I froze, clutching my dad's hunting knife I'd brought along just in case. Lying still and pretending to be asleep, he muttered to himself, watching me intently, until finally he left. The following days were exhausting. I stayed near the other campers whenever possible, but Adam would still pop up unexpectedly, sometimes playing with my hair or even trying to sniff it. It was disturbing. At night, he'd creep around my tent or try to go through my things, but I kept my essentials inside my sleeping bag with me. One evening, he was sent home early by the scout leaders. I think one of the other campers had spoken up about his behavior. While the others seemed confused, I saw a scout cross his arms firmly, watching as Adam left. Adam looked bewildered, as though he didn't understand why he was being sent away. After that, the rest of the camp went smoothly, and I felt a huge sense of relief. Looking back, I realized how unsettling the whole experience was. I'm grateful my dad insisted I bring his knife with me for protection, even though they weren't officially allowed. It was a reminder to trust my instincts and be cautious. In 2012, I was part of a group of friends who made it a yearly tradition to go camping for a long weekend at a particular spot. This place was in a scenic area right by the edge of a large reservoir on government land. The reservoir had a dam, so during April, the water levels were usually low or even dried up enough for people to walk across. Camping was allowed there as long as campers kept things quiet and left the area clean. It was usually a fun, peaceful experience. The campsites were spread out just enough to give some privacy, but close enough that you could easily meet others. That year, our campsite was set on a gentle hill, with another group camping just below us and another above. The first night passed without any issues, but on the second day, some new people set up camp at the site below ours. We didn't think much of it and continued enjoying our day and night. Around midnight, however, the group below us got extremely loud. They were shouting, yelling, and their music was blaring. Our friend Mark went down to ask if they could keep it down, but they immediately punched him in the face. He returned to us, saying he was pretty sure they were high on something. This put a damper on our mood, and most of us felt a bit on edge after that. I was tired, though, so I decided to head to bed. Some of my friends stayed up, including Mark and a couple, Jen and Dave, who were visiting another campsite where we'd met some new people earlier. I could still hear the loud music and rowdy group below, but I tried to ignore it and drifted off. I don't know exactly when, but I suddenly woke up to loud yelling and screaming outside my tent. I rushed outside and found our campsite in chaos. One of my friends was clutching their chest, and others were shouting to call 911. I quickly learned what had happened. Not long after I'd gone to sleep, the people from the site below came up to confront Mark again. On their way, they came across Jen and Dave walking back. Since Dave and Mark looked similar, they mistook Dave for Mark and hit both him and Jen over the head with a bottle. It was chaos after that. From what I was told, as our group sat around the campfire, 2 or 3 large men suddenly appeared from the darkness. They were holding a knife and a large blade. Mark noticed the weapons and tried to talk to them, but before he could say much, one of the men stabbed him in the chest. At the same time, a few people from the site above saw the men approaching and came down to help. One guy, Dan, was heading down the hill when the man with the large knife stabbed him in the stomach. After that, it was pure panic. Someone called 911, but the nearest ambulance was over half an hour away. By the time I came out of my tent, Dan was bleeding heavily, and it was clear he needed help quickly. His friends put him in the back of a car and sped off to meet the ambulance halfway. Mark's wound wasn't as severe as Dan's, so we were able to keep him calm until the ambulance finally arrived. Meanwhile, the men with the knives disappeared into the dark, heading back to their campsite, then fled in their SUV. My boyfriend and I jumped into his car and drove to the entrance to flag down the police as they arrived. Once they got there, they told us to stay in the car while a K9 unit was released to track down the attackers. By the end of the night, the police had caught the men. They tried to escape by driving across the dried lake bed, only to get stuck in a muddy section. As suspected, they were on a mix of drugs. Thankfully, both Dan and Mark survived, though Dan lost a lot of blood and needed weeks to recover. Dave and Jen ended up with huge bruises on their heads, and one of them might have had a concussion, but I can't recall. This was one of the scariest nights of my life, and some of us later had to testify against them in court. To get a sense of my story, it helps to know a bit about trespassing laws in my country. Essentially, there aren't any strict ones. As long as you're respectful and don't damage anything, you're free to walk over most fields or hills, and, as in my case, camp on any beach you like. The main rule is to leave things as you found them. I've loved camping since I was a kid. My family used to go several times a year with a big group of my parents' friends and their kids. Altogether, there were usually around 10 of us, which made organizing things tricky because we always traveled to this remote beach on the coast. We weren't alone, though. There were always yachts anchored off the shore with people on them and other campers spread along the beach. Many had kids or teenagers, so it wasn't a party scene. It felt more like a relaxed family gathering spot. They even had a small building with toilets and showers nearby. Even though this place was isolated, I guess the local council got tired of people using the bushes. We took a camping trip in spring 2011. I'm not great with dates, but I remember because I'd gotten my dog the winter before in 2010. I picked her out that November from a shelter as a birthday gift to myself since I paid for her adoption fee. She was a 6-month-old pup named Ruby. She'd been rescued from a bad situation involving dog fights. We're not totally sure what breed she is, but she looks like a mix of lurcher and staffy. She's incredibly gentle with people and most dogs, but if you're a threat, she won't hesitate to stand her ground. By the time of this trip, I'd had Ruby for a few months. She'd never gone camping with us before, but in my family, dogs are just part of the adventure. So when we piled into the car, Ruby came along too. This time, none of the family friends could join, so it was just me, my sister, my dad, and my mom. I didn't mind. I was happy to play with Ruby and still had my sister for company. The drive took around 6 hours, and since we left a bit late, though I don't recall why, we arrived just as the sun was setting. Not the best time to set up camp, but we'd expected to see other campers already there with campfires lighting the beach. Strangely, it was empty. Despite this, my parents started unloading and setting up the tent. They asked us to grab some of the lighter bags from the car. I rolled down the window for Ruby before getting out since it was unusually warm. While we fumbled around in the dusk, the atmosphere felt eerie. There's a single road that circles the beach, forming a loop around it. After about 15 minutes of trying to set up the tent, my mom noticed a car that had circled a few times. She asked my dad if he'd seen it. My dad shrugged it off, he's like that. But after a few more minutes, the car pulled up next to ours, and a man got out. He was about 20 feet away, and with the low light, we could only see him by our flashlights. At first, we thought he might be a park ranger or someone from the Wildlife Trust since they sometimes come out to do checks. But as he walked closer, it was clear he was drunk or high. His steps were unsteady and, more worryingly, he was holding a large knife, at least 15 inches, though I was young, so I might be off on the size. To his credit, my dad reacted quickly, standing up with the camping mallet and putting himself between us and the stranger. The man began shouting that we couldn't camp there, claiming he was just letting us know. My dad tried to stay calm, saying we'd leave, but the man kept approaching. My dad's tone,